Hello, all good people. The weather report for space weather indicates that we have a high low energy electron flux. Background protons, as usual, at normal levels. Wind speeds up to 500 kilometers a second for coronal hole stream, which is an average speed. It's not super fast by any means. But we see constant coiling of the magnetosphere with or without a geomagnetic storm. We have had some geomagnetic storms. We'll show you those KP indexes shortly. I do believe it's on here somewhere. But the coiling of the planetary field lines are quite characteristic of electrons because they occur when there's no creasing or crimping of the magnetosphere. There's actually a slight expansion. When we look at the actual simulations, we see where the red and the blue, at least in this particular diagram, they run almost opposite of one another. And this is not, these are measuring the exact same magnetosphere, the closed field lines, but it's two different satellites that are on completely opposite sides of the sun. So why would a satellite on one side of the sun at the same time the other satellite has a well or a trough, it has a spike? Why is it run completely opposite of the other satellite? This is GOES 13 and GOES 15. Why does that happen? It's because there's a direction of electrons coming. They're coming from one direction. And on one side of the sun, the electrons will run with the wind of the sun. And on the other side, the electrons will oppose the sun. When you look at something that actually measures the magnetic field connection to the sun, where that's the blue line there, you see it's almost unaffected. And you see that the Y complex, or the Y component of our magnetosphere, is something that reaches out into the solar system. It has nothing to do with the spin of the Earth. It has nothing to do with the sun's gravity. It's its own component that never got much attention because it's not related to geomagnetic storms, but lately it's been affecting our magnetosphere. And generally when the Y component spikes, so does the black, or the BZ component. The BZ component is created by our spin. So how do you increase and decrease our strength of our own magnetosphere is related to the number of electrons that are flowing through those rings and through those loops and through those lines. And so when you have a surge of electrons coming from somewhere other than the sun, it surges your magnetic field. So we look at the magnetosphere. If we're getting a constant stream of electrons, then we should have a constant presence of energy in the tailstream, because we are passing in between the brown dwarf and the sun. So we are theorizing with a 90% confidence. And so as we go through the week, all we see is a constant presence, usually electrons creating energy in the tailstream. And that should show up as a lot of turbulence. It really does, and it already has. When you look at the total electron count, you see the United States being targeted, total electron count. But, you know, were the days where these X and Y components used to run together. It's funny how when we theorized that the planet X, its wind was running almost in conjunction and in union with the sun's particles, how their magnetic fields almost mimic one another. Isn't that funny? We look at sunspots and we see the sunspots are forming. They're higher, lower latitudes. They'll eventually be more and more sunspots, and with that, more X-rays. If you don't think we can stand any more radiation coming from the sky, well, think again, because it's going to be coming. We have had several geomagnetic storms related to a coronal hole stream. There's just one problem. The coronal hole streams are having trouble getting above 500 kilometers a second. But the other problem is that we're not seeing any coronal holes on the sun, just at the north and south pole of the sun. And so we're seeing not huge fluxes in densities, and we're seeing a rather warm temperatures on the particle count. Warmer than you would think coming from a brown dwarf way out by Uranus, but they're not super hot, and we do see periodic fluctuations downward, like a mixing that's consistent of cooler particles and slower particles. But I'm not ready to say that all the particles we're reading during this geomagnetic storm are not coming from the sun based upon the temperature. But when we look at our standoff position, this is just nothing that measures the position of our main magnetosphere ring, and you can see constant turbulence, constant fluxing without any huge compressions or huge releases. To me, that tells me that the planet X's electrons are running opposition to the sun's electrons right now, creating more turbulence, more of a consistent compression of that magnetosphere distance, hovering around 9 Earth radii. And it's supposed to be up around 12, 13, 14 Earth radii. But it's not bouncing back up there. When we look at the actual magnetosphere, we'll run it by kind of quickly, but you see the round balls that look teardrop in shape. They expand the magnetosphere. They don't crease it. And then you usually get 2 of these twirling, swirling spheres that eject into the tail stream, followed by this V shape, which generally is helium meeting resistance. That V shape is associated with a slight crimp. So that tells me it's particles that are exerting particle pressure. Electrons exert very little particle pressure, but other particles, protons and helium, exert higher particle pressure, just like a true wind would do. So we see relentless pulsing of that. So then we go and look at the visible light to see if we see any anomalies happening in the sun. We do see some loop activity showing up as an increased light over there on one of the limbs. But down here we almost get a intrusion of electrons that create a white glow and create a movement and motion and direction to some of these white light anomalies. And I'll get a better picture of it for you here in just a second. But the bottom right is where it's most obvious. You see almost like a flow of particles, and it's really traveling in a clockwise fashion, spiraling in around the sun. And if they are electrons, then you can use your right hand rule to figure out the direction that those electrons are flowing. If you have a magnetic field that's rotating clockwise, take your thumb and point your fingers in the direction of clockwise on your right hand. And your right hand's pointing directly at the sun. So you are actually seeing a clockwise rotation to some of the white light anomalies as these electrons stream through the helium and light up and create light in the corona of the sun. And that's really the source of that high density, looks like wings. That's a helium focusing cone. It has reformed in the last year, but you can kind of see those waves of particles traveling clockwise, especially down here. So point your thumb right at the screen, and your fingers your curved fingers are showing a clockwise rotation. That tells you the electrons are coming straight at the sun right now. So that Earth is between the sun and something that is the source of electrons. Now, gee, what could that be? And we're looking for coronal holes. We didn't see any equatorial coronal holes. We saw one tiny one that would not account for 4 days, 5 days of constant turbulence and geomagnetic storms. We've looked very closely and could not find anything that would account for 5 days, 4 days of auroras. And the only thing we could think of is the direct opposition of particles. The sun's particles coming in contact with a high density electron pulses. At the top of the screen near the northern coronal hole, a lot of times they try to tell you that it's the northern or southern coronal holes that are bathing the Earth in these particles. But it makes you wonder because there's nothing even close to being equatorial. So why are we getting coronal hole streams hitting Earth coming from the North Pole of the sun? I just don't think that's quite frequent. So then we go to regular weather, and we see that this storm, Zeta, it popped up in a day south of the Yucatan, and then in 2 days it strengthened, and then next thing you know, it was in the Gulf, and then by the 4th day, it was at a very familiar place, the Mississippi River Delta. And we have to keep asking why hurricanes are targeting the Mississippi River Delta. And generally what happens is the jet stream acts as like a shield and pushes away a lot of the hurricanes. The only way they can really sneak in is to come up through Florida, which is where all of them have come up from. And we go back and we look at hurricane tracks, and we don't see a lot of redundant hurricanes repeating themselves over and over again. But then in 2016, we saw an area where Julia and Bonnie, but a lot of hurricanes have targeted that one area above Georgia there, and there's a ton of nuclear power plants all clustered in that 3-state area, and so it makes you wonder if somebody's putting pressure on that. Also up there north of Atlanta, there's a collection of nuclear power plants along the Mississippi River. So we're getting almost like these hurricanes since 2016 have been getting steered targeting the Mississippi River Delta and where these nuclear power plants are. They just keep getting hit over and over again. But as the years click on by, each year the oceans get hotter and we get more storms, sometimes bigger storms. And when you look at all the storm tracks, 65 Atlantic hurricanes since 2005, you could see that there wasn't, for the number of storms, they weren't all crossing at the same point, the same nuclear power plant, the same river delta, the same port. But in the last 4 years, we've seen an extraordinary number of hurricanes ending up in the same geographical location, the exact same spot as previous hurricanes. So what's going on? Makes you wonder. And this one, Zeta, kept, usually as soon as these things hit landfall, they start shredding and going in all directions. This one maintained its eye even over landfall. That was kind of different as well. So anyway, there's your solar system update. It looks like we're passing in between the brown dwarf and the sun. We will know earthquakes should start to pick up any day. And so we'll keep a track on that for you. And until next time, be prepared, not scared.